Cinco de Mayo, aka Drinko de Mayo. A day to go out and drink, get wasted instead of think about the courage and strength it took to defeat Napoleon's ranks. As ancestors went to battle, Frenchmen who decided to travel onto sacred indigenous lands came destructive military bands. Instead of reaching the Civil War, they were defeated on Mexico's shore. Onto sacred indigenous lands came destructive military bands. Instead of reaching the Civil War, they were defeated on Mexico's shore. In 1882, in Puebla, Mexico, Napoleon's army suffered a disastrous blow by an army of less than half their size. Victorious, they became Union allies. Benito Juarez was reinstalled as president, and back to France the French went. A victory to be celebrated is not an excuse to get inebriated. Onto sacred indigenous lands came destructive military bands. Instead of reaching the Civil War, they were defeated on Mexico's shores. Onto sacred indigenous lands came destructive military bands. Instead of reaching the Civil War, they were defeated on Mexico's shore. Yeah, Cinco de Mayo, celebrating victories. It's not about drinking, it's about courage, strength, and victories. Thank you.
American free trade, once the North American Free Trade Agreement came into effect back in 1994, the economies of the US and Mexico became more integrated than ever. And they were already very, very much integrated for 100 years before that. But as a result of this kind of global process, working people on both sides of the Mexico-US border are not only affected by this integration of these economies. In a way, we are the object of it, because corporations are seeking to maximize profits and to push wages and benefits to the bottom, and to manage the flow of people who are displaced as a result of that, as well as rolling back our rights and social benefits we've fought for and achieved over decades, and weaken working class movements on both sides of the border in both countries. And here we see the end result of it, a maquiladora, a worker in a maquiladora. This one is Plásticos Baja Cal in Tijuana, where they had tried to organize an independent union and got smashed for it back in 1993. So this kind of global production undermines workers' rights. Grupo Mexico, for instance, which is one of the largest mining companies in the world, belonging to a Mexican family, the Larrea family, but in partnership with US corporations as well. It's able to use its profits that it gains in mining operations, for instance, in Peru, to subsidize the cost of breaking the strike in Cananea, which has been going on now for 12 years. And then it bought copper mines in Arizona and forced US workers and the United Steelworkers of America out on strike as well. The privatization of electricity in Mexico, which the Mexican Electrical Workers Union has been fighting for 2 decades. And here we can see a member of the SME in the Zocalo during one of the struggles, the hunger strike that workers undertook in that process. It doesn't just affect Mexicans, because when Mexico's laws restricting electricity generation to the government were weakened and essentially abolished by the last PRI government in Mexico, what happens is that they produce power for the US grid. These, kind of runaway generators produce power for the US grid at lower wages with less regulation. What that really means is that for people who belong to utility unions, for companies like PG&E or for public utilities here in the US, it means that we have a reason to help Mexican workers resist privatization and support the SME when it demands nationalization or the renationalization of the electrical grid in Mexico, which is one of the union's main demands today. But the US is also exporting ideology. Education reform in Mexico, for instance, comes from the Gates and the Broad foundations. And these are the same privatizers that attack US teachers. In Mexico, they're supported by the US government, the US Agency for International Development. And their partner in Mexico is an organization called Mexicanos Primero, which is run by Claudio X Gonzalez and Claudio Gonzalez Guajardo, who come from one of the wealthiest families in Mexico. They have a US partner, James Sensenbrenner, who we might remember because Sensenbrenner wrote HR 4425. That was the bill that would have made it a felony to be undocumented. And that was what we marched in the streets for in 2006 in order to defeat it. Their attacks on teachers, what they did really was they set the climate for the disappearance and the murder of the 43 students in Ayotzinapa. In both countries, the main union battles seek to preserve what we as workers of the network was created while NAFTA was still being debated, the Coalition for Justice in the Maquiladoras. Most of its efforts were directed to supporting workers trying to organize independent unions on the border to get out from under the sweetheart protection contracts. And here we see an election that took place at Plásticos Bajacal. That was the factory where we saw the worker making the coat hangers back at the beginning of the NAFTA era. And you can see that workers are being forced to vote out in the open and declare their sympathy or their union choice in front of the company and the company union representatives in cooperation with the Mexican Labor Board representative, the guy who's pointing his finger. And this is what Mexican unions have been trying to reform and abolish, a system the Mexican unions have been trying to reform and abolish for 2 decades. Workers rebelled at the huge Sony plant in Nuevo Laredo, and they were beaten and attacked with fire hoses when they tried to elect their own leaders. In the late 1990s, workers demanding their own union went on strike twice at Tijuana's Hanyang factory, one of the largest, longest, and most important efforts to organize an independent union on the border. But other workers tried the same thing at companies like Durobag or Custom Trim or Levi's. These are all US-owned companies. Several years ago, the Mineros, the miners' union, began a process of drawing closer to the United Steelworkers Union, and both of them are locked in an all-out conflict with Grupo Mexico. During the 12-year strike in Cananea, US unions sent money and food across the border, organized support actions here in the US, and they gave refuge to the Mineros president in Canada when the Mexican government would have thrown him in prison. One of the things that happened as a result of the election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, in that same election, the head of the miners' union, Napoleon Gómez Urrutia, was elected senator from the state of Sonora and was finally able to come home after having been in exile. And then even after years of deprivation, miners in Cananea sent support to their sisters and brothers in Arizona and New Mexico when Grupo Mexico forced them out on strike. The SME, the electrical workers, got support through the Trinational Solidarity Alliance, with press conferences and meetings between the SME and FL-CIO leaders. Over 50,000 workers, students, and human rights activists demonstrated at Mexican consulates around the world when the Mexican government attacked the SME and privatized and then dissolved the Compañía de Luz y Fuerza, which was the company, the state-owned company that the SME members worked for. Between 2013 and 2015, Triqui and Mixteco farm workers, migrants from Oaxaca, organized and went on strike both in Baja California and in Burlington, Washington. They then mounted an international boycott of Driscoll's, the world's largest berry company. They won a contract in Washington, and in Baja, they organized an independent union that's still fighting for one. Bonifacio Martinez, who we see here in the, well, I guess everybody's got a little gorra, but in the white shirt there, a farm worker in Baja California says, if the companies are international now, we the workers must also become international. We are facing the same enemy, Driscoll's. Just like in the United States, here in San Quintin, we decided to come out of the shadows into the light of the world. Workers went on strike for an independent union in Juarez in 2017 at some of the largest factories in North America. And then in Matamoros, over 40,000 workers struck US assembly plants when their owners refused to pay the increase in the minimum wage that was ordered by Andrés Manuel López Obrador just as he took office in 2018. And most recently, workers struck US-owned plants that refused to obey the government's order to stop production during the COVID crisis. At the Lear plant alone, 13 workers died from the virus. The US defense industry increasingly depends on continuous production from maquiladoras. The State Department threatened the Mexican government, and the companies were allowed to restart production. Yet here in the US, there was no outcry when that happened, when our government basically, and our corporations located here, forced workers back into those plants, knowing that many of them would die as a result. In North Mexico, the maquiladora industry is still enormous. 3,000 plants employ over 1.3 million workers. A vibrant and strong labor movement on the border would change Mexico's politics and our politics here in the US as well. But we know what NAFTA did. The US lost 1 million jobs, but millions of Mexicans were thrown off their land and out of their jobs, and the number of people who had to cross the border to survive rose from 4.5 to 12 million people in just 10 years. So solidarity means knowing that we are connected. Miners blacklisted in Cananea, or electrical workers fired in Mexico City, they become workers and union organizers in Phoenix, or Los Angeles, and New York, or here in San Francisco. The farm workers of the West Coast, whether they work in San Quintin, Watsonville, or Burlington, Washington, come from the same communities. They speak the same languages, and they face the same agribusiness giants. Fighting for the rights of Mexican and immigrant workers in the US is part of solidarity. And we need a culture of solidarity where we understand that our own welfare is connected to the welfare of other workers, and we're ready to act on that understanding. We can't just be glad that we have a job and a union that gives us a wage that can support our family, and then turn our eyes away from a worker on strike in San Quintin or Cananea, or an electrical worker on a hunger strike in Mexico City, or a worker fighting the closure of a factory here in California. We are all tied together.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It is hard to go after David, just because he had such a great presentation. So happy to be sharing the stage with David. And thank you for those beautiful pictures that we continue to use through our work. My name is Sara Martinez. I'm an indigenous Zapotec from the state of Oaxaca, and also was born and raised there and came here when I was 16. My parents until now are farm workers in the Salinas Valley. I don't speak my native language. I got lost with my grandparents. I know people always wondered, and I don't speak Zapoteco, but I'm happy to be working with many folks that are trilingual, bilingual, and that have been able to maintain their language through our work at Centro Binacional. So again, we've been working, and we're founded in 1993. It's an organization that was created by the need of serving the indigenous immigrant community in California.
When we try to understand the reason why people migrate, often risking their lives, The dominant narrative is that they are living, they're homeless because of poverty, violence, and following the American dream. This narrative is partly true and has different layers on it. First of all, I will argue that the dream of a dignified life is a human and better opportunities is a human and universal dream. Second, we need to keep in mind that the United States shares some responsibility for the history of violence and the entrenched poverty in Central America and Mexico. Immigrants also, and finally, immigrants not always leave. They are oftentimes recruited to come to the US and work for low wages, jobs. So the US foreign policy and the imposition of economic policies in Latin America have generated entrenched socioeconomic inequality and the imposition of repressive governments, which has contributed to massive migration and violence. The worst example is the overthrow of Salvador Allende, president elected by popular vote in Chile by the armed forces in 1973. This coup was the inspiration of Henry Kissinger, US Secretary of State at that time. The Chilean government led a systematic repression of the opposition while imposing a privatizing neoliberal economy. The governor's goal was to limit, if not destroy, the power of the unions. This policy was also imposed by successive military dictatorships in countries of the region, such as Argentina, Uruguay, and was achieved through the control of local armies. The officers of these armies, we have to remember that were trained in the well-known School of the Americas, where they are even learned torture techniques. The training was not only in war techniques, but mainly in war techniques against the insurgency, that is, possible left armed groups, which existed in some countries and Argentina and Uruguay. Even to these days, we can witness in Central America this style of foreign states control by means of the military. Let's not forget El Golpe de Estado, promoted by the US in 2009 in Honduras, where President Manuel Zelaya, who encouraged greater citizen participation in government decisions, was removed by the armed forces. The US trained the Honduras armed forces and supplies them with weapons. In all of these countries, the effects were the same: repression, death, concentration of wealth in a few hands, and displacements of people, more so workers, impoverished, and marginalized families. The common destination for migrating is the United States. The economic policies promoted by the United States are known by the privatization of public industries and institutions. The most common example of this policy is oil. In countries like Mexico, Argentina, and others, the extraction and commercialization of oil was under the state control for years, but slowly and in complicity with local governments, it passed into the private hands of mainly American companies, depriving the states of a great source of income for infrastructure, education, and public health, in addition to generating unemployment. The US shares also a big deal of responsibility for the existence of dictatorial and repressive governments in much of Latin America in the last 100 years. The indifference to human and labor rights abuses in those countries is unparalleled. The United States has also used other methods to impose its foreign policy, such as diplomatic pressure. For example, the free trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, implemented since 1994, allow the massive entry of US products without payment of taxes to Mexico, eliminating internal production, as happened with the poultry industry, leaving thousands of unemployed people. Transgenic corn also entered Mexico extensively, putting maiz criollo, a cultural and culinary symbol of rural Mexico, on the brink of disappearance. In the south states of Mexico, campesinos stop cultivating their land and saw migration as their only chance to have an income for their families. While at the same time, there is a need for the low-wage labor in the northwest states of Mexico and the US. Corrupt governments supported by the US in countries such as Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are also responsible for prevalent poverty in Central America, which displaces people who do not want to starve to death. Lack of investments in infrastructure and public health means that some climate change events such as hurricanes, floods, and droughts have catastrophic effects. Some of the most impacted people from these events see migration as the only solution to their problems. Migrants come to work, not to live out of charity. And by the way, let's don't forget that immigrants without permit to work are denied access to social assistance. Some of these political and economic events inform us of the root causes of migration. Immigrants' only dream is having a job and being able to provide food for their families and education for their children.
The binational experience is what helps us understand the macro developments that went on between, in my particular case, best way to explain it, how it really happened. And we developed a seeing what David correctly and just succinctly points out, the issues of trade and foreign policy. These things, right, were kind of part and parcel of our thinking. That I'm also like to address the issue of guest worker and why I'm so proud to be involved in that struggle along with others on this call. Is that we're looking for out for the interest of those who aren't here yet. Such a visionary outlook, right, to demand and insist upon fair treatment for the persons and the workers who are not yet here.
What do we mean by a just immigration reform? Well, many of us at this event participate in a national campaign called the Dignity Campaign. And this is what we mean by a just immigration reform law. First of all, that it offer a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million or so undocumented people already here, and a just process for migrants who have yet to arrive. We have to factor in the people who are going to migrate in the future. Otherwise, we're left with an entire community in the next several years who have no way, no means to access applying for residency. Number two, end the deportations and shut down immigrant jails and detention centers. We cannot morally accept any legislation that includes more resources for inland and for border enforcement. Number three, reverse employer sanctions so that all workers, regardless of immigration status, may work where they want. Many of us are old enough to remember that back in 1986, that was the last law. A lot of people call it an amnesty law, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which did offer some people a means to apply for their residency. But the condition, the negative aspect of it, what had to be, what people traded was employer sanctions, what we call now employer sanctions. And that is the beginning of the criminalized relationship between employers and employees. People should have the moral right to work anywhere they want. Number four, end the militarization of the US-Mexico border. One of the main reasons why our women's coalition here in Sonoma County cannot support President Joe Biden's proposal the Citizenship Act of 2021, even though it does contain some opportunity for some people to be able to gain their residency. But it also, again, it puts military technology into the bill, which would cause more suffering. Basically, this would simply add to the US government's ability to capture people, detain them, and ultimately deport them. And then finally, we can, what is a dignified immigration reform bill? It cannot contain the expansion or the solidifying or the institutionalization beyond what we have now of guest worker programs. This way, people don't have to dangerously cross the border. They're able to enter the US and have their work authorization. In its essence or in its nature, exploitative, because workers are attached to their employer when they migrate to work for that particular employer. Farm workers and other workers, which means that if they want to complain about unfair wages, unfair working conditions, not only can will employers retaliate by firing them, but these workers will also be deported.
Georgia, no peace I find. Just an old sweet song keeps Georgia on my mind. Just an old sweet song keeps Georgia on my mind. Cinco de Mayo, on the one hand, saved the Union because the French had already made the deal with the kidnappers. Don't ever call them slave owners. They didn't own anything. They were kidnappers, traffickers, human traffickers. They had already made a deal with the French that once they took over Mexico, they would support this. They would support the tyrants, the kidnappers, and that would have given. That was the strongest army in the world at that time. It would have given the South tyrannical more power. Anyway, it didn't happen. Na parashi gustiandali radicala nolonua nesta lenda yakisheluna neruna nericala ye si tu nolonua kayakashilase wachini nirase rugaba kabele gieva Gaterayo bastiu, rinaba ukashiluna, nesta lenda yakishe, nesta lenda yakisheluna.